firm believer that you don't achieve greatness on your own. There's always someone there to lend a hand. That was Greg Louganis, the Olympic gold medalist for springboard and platform diving. In that spirit, I would like to introduce both Robin Gao and Dwayne Black, who are helping our congregation to further understand and accept marginalized communities today, with a particular focus on the LGBTQ+ identities and community.
Awesome. So good to be here with everybody today. I just gotta adjust this. I'm very short.
There you go.
So I'm really excited and grateful that folks want to take some time to talk about the queer and trans community. Like they said, I'm Robin, and Rain will be up in a little bit. If you move your cursor over to the screen, it'll let me switch. Yeah. Okay, great, it's working now. Awesome, so a little bit about this space. I encourage folks to ask questions at the end. Awesome, thank you. So a little bit about this space. I encourage folks to ask questions at the end of the presentation. We have a lot to cover in a short amount of time, and so we are gonna dive right into it. Just some things for people to know. Not all LGBTQ+ people have the exact same opinions. So what we're offering you is based on our own lived experiences and our experience doing education work for over 15 years collectively. If you want to share, we encourage you to speak from your own experiences, though there will be opportunities for you to talk a little bit. Know that LGBTQ+ people are in every space. We're definitely in the room with you. So if you are part of the community and you want to add your voice to the conversation, you're totally welcome to. Show respect to yourself and others, and know every workshop training has its limitations. And by that, it doesn't mean that we're not going to cover a lot of topics. What it means is that we're starting conversations that you're going to take into your life and take into the world. Because we can't undo LGBTQ+ injustice in about 45 minutes. That would be a really large task. But we are going to try to bring in conversation about a lot of different topics. The majority of these topics were sourced from the conversations that we had with the congregation, both with LGBTQ+ members and the general congregation. So today, a little bit of a roadmap. We're going to define some basic LGBTQ+ terminology and concepts, as well as understanding the social and cultural context of those terms. We're going to learn about pronouns and their connection to the LGBTQ+ community. We're going to examine some of the roots of anti-LGBTQ+ bias and discrimination, and we're going to develop some skills for navigating conversations around difference. So that is no small feat for a short amount of time, so I'm going to dive right in. Like I said, please hold on to your questions. There will be time at the end, and me and Rain will be here after service too. If you're like, I really want to unpack this idea more, we're really happy to continue those conversations. So starting off, we're going to talk a little bit about the acronym. I'm sure a lot of you have heard this acronym 1,000,001 times, but we really believe in entering conversations all on the same playing field. So I am going to go through and define all of the terms for y'all. And what I will say, don't feel like you have to get out a notepad. The takeaway that I want people to understand about all of the terms in the LGBTQIA2+ community is that there's going to be multiple definitions for a single term. People identify and understand themselves in varied ways. And so in learning the definitions, I think it's less about making sure that you can recite the exact definition of a word and more about broadening your mind to understanding that people understand themselves and the world in a really wide variety of ways. So starting with the L stands for lesbian. The acronym actually used to commonly start with the G, but the L started to be placed before the G to place an emphasis on the role that lesbians have had in the LGBTQ+ community in terms of leadership. And also that often lesbians are left out of the conversation, and sometimes people focus on the perspectives of men rather than women, just because of the patriarchy and stuff like that. But lesbian generally stands for a woman who loves other women. Today, a lot of folks who are non-binary also identify as lesbian. We're going to break down the term non-binary as we keep going, but just know that not everybody who identifies as a lesbian is a woman, and that the definition has become a lot more expansive. The G stands for gay. which is interesting because it often refers to men who love other men, but sometimes we'll also hear it as an umbrella term for the whole LGBTQ plus community. The B stands for bisexual, so that's somebody who is attracted to their own gender and other genders. You also might hear people define it as attraction to both men and women. Just like I said with the definition of lesbian, you'll see a lot of the definitions are becoming more expansive as we understand that there's not just two genders. And T stands for trans, or transgender. Trans is more common. I mean, transgender is not an inappropriate word, but more people in the community, I feel like generally just say trans. And that stands for somebody whose gender is different than that they were assigned at birth. And again, we'll talk about that concept a little bit more later. The I stands for intersex, A stands for asexual, and 2 stands for two-spirit. A lot of people ask me then, like, what does the plus mean? And they get a little bit stressed out. It's gonna be okay. We just have a lot of identities under the umbrella, and the plus is signifying that there are so many other identities that fall under this community. We are united by shared history, shared communities. I also encourage folks to consider some of the Western centrism in the LGBTQ plus acronym, because people of different genders and sexualities outside of just straight and cisgender have existed across the world, across time. And generally the LGBTQIA2 plus acronym is taking a little bit of like a Western perspective. So that was a lot, but we're gonna keep going. So we're gonna break it down a little bit more nuanced into talking about sexuality and gender. So sexuality, I always say, is who you go to bed with. Gender is who you go to bed as. So sexuality being often broken down into romantic and sexual attraction. Romantic attraction being like who you want to have a candlelit dinner with. Sexual attraction being a little bit more physical. We also hear aromantic and asexual. Aromantic is someone who doesn't experience romance. And asexual is someone who doesn't experience that sexual attraction. Now, aromantic folks and asexual folks might still engage in like physical touch and things like that. There's not one experience that totally characterizes aromantic and asexual folks, but they just don't experience that specific sensation of enjoying romance or sex in different kinds of ways. We use the term orientation rather than like preference when we talk about sexuality, because it's an innate part of ourselves. It's not like, preference sounds like pizza toppings or something like that. We're choosing like life partners and people who we care about. And so orientation illustrates that really clear, important connection to our self, what our sexualities are. Lesbian, gay, bisexual, and so many other identities fall under the sexuality umbrella. I think the best way to understand somebody and their sexuality is if you're close to them, like ask them what the term means to them, because people's perspectives are always going to be a little bit different. This visualization, Rain actually came up with, so I have to credit him with it. He said it's cool to think about sexuality as like a soundboard with all the different volume things. So on the top there we have sexual attraction, and you can experience a little or a lot. Romantic attraction being also like a spectrum of no romantic attraction to more romantic attraction. And then we have behavior and identity, because those also don't always line up. Sometimes I identify as bisexual, and sometimes there's a bias towards bisexual folks where if you say have only had relationships with one gender, people will say like, oh, you're not actually bisexual, you're just gay or you're just straight. That's if someone identifies as bisexual, they identify as bisexual. You don't have to like hit a certain quota of people who you've had relationships with. And likewise, there are a lot of people who are gay or lesbian who have relationships with the like air quote the opposite gender because of the ways that we're socialized. Because that's the script you were given, and so sometimes people later in life or even younger will realize after having a relationship that, oh, like actually I'm queer. So sexuality and gender, they are definitely separate things, but the thing that's interesting about them is that they do speak to each other sometimes. And let me elaborate a little bit more on that. So for instance, sometimes LGBTQ plus people will dress in a certain way or wear certain things to kind of signal that they might be part of the queer community. And this gets difficult because it doesn't necessarily mean that you're queer, but there are certain aesthetics that we've historically used. I think one that people might be like a little bit aware of is, at least when I was in elementary school, people were always joking that there was like a gay ear to have peers. That is not 100% true, though there is evidence that in some communities, people did pierce one of their ears to suggest that they were usually a gay person. Not true across the board, but that's an illustration of how you're trying to express some part of yourself to signal to someone else that you might be queer. We can't look at people and know whether or not they're queer, but it's helpful to understand that sexuality and gender like talk to each other. They're not the same thing though. So when we talk about gender, we have identity and then expression. Words that relate to identity would be words like man, woman, non-binary person. That is usually a little bit more held in your brain. So I understand myself as a genderqueer person. And then we have expression, which is how you're displaying your gender outwardly. That's where we would see words like masculine, feminine, androgynous. That's about what you're portraying to the world. And we know that there's all kinds of stereotypes, right? So we might say that women are, air quote, supposed to be feminine. We know that that's not true or just, but we know that there's a script that people are expected to behave in a certain way. And so it's important to understand that people's identities, you don't always have to conform to those stereotypes, and queer people often don't, and non-queer people don't as well. Women shouldn't always have to be feminine, men shouldn't always have to be masculine. Talking a little bit more about roles and stereotypes, the other thing that's really interesting about gender is it's totally in the context of where you live and your time period, your region, your culture, because there's no consistent definition of how people portray their genders. An example that I think about is that like where we live and in my own just like upbringing, like it's not super common for men to wear like flowy garments, but in certain areas of the world, everyone wears a flowy garment that might look kind of like a dress, and people will make those distinctions as to in genders in different ways. So that's just one example of how it's not like a one size fits all. We read each other's genders really based on this whole matrix of contexts. The other example that I find interesting is like if we think of like kings in like medieval Europe, they're usually like heavily gilded. They also often wear high heels. Which if a man is wearing high heels today, we kind of consider them gender non-conforming. But at the time, it was considered like hyper masculine for someone to be wearing high heels. So now we're gonna jump a little bit into talking about trans and non-binary. Like I said, I know that we're going quickly through these things, but I wanna get us to a place where we can talk a little bit more. Thank you, I appreciate it.
We want to fix that.
Hello. Great.
Yeah.
So trans and cis are both adjectives. I think that that's the first thing to understand. So like a trans person, a cis person. Cis just means someone whose gender is the same as they were assigned at birth. So if you were born and someone assigned you female at birth and you're a woman, that would mean that you're a cis woman. I put the emphasis that it's an adjective because oftentimes people hear it as like a value judgment or something to be ashamed of or something like that, and really it's just a way to describe somebody's experience. Gender nonconforming essentially just means not conforming to whatever society kind of has dictated as our gender standard, and we've already established that that's a pretty fluid definition as well. We tend to say sex assigned at birth or gender assigned at birth when talking about what people were assigned, like when they were born. We use this language opposed to other things. Sometimes I'll hear people say things like, oh, she's biologically a man, which would be an inappropriate way to talk about a trans woman. And if you needed to refer to somebody's gender they were assigned, you would say something like assigned male at birth or assigned female at birth. Trans is also an umbrella term. It encompasses a lot of different identities. Terms like non-binary, both trans men and trans women, people who are agender, genderqueer, and many other identities. Again, trans being someone's gender is different than that you were assigned at birth. So it encompasses a lot of different experiences under that umbrella. So now we're gonna move into talking about pronouns in gender inclusive language, and so I'm gonna pass it off to Rain. And like I said, keep in mind, like, hold those questions, we'll have a lot of time to chat at the end.
Is that okay? Can everybody hear me? Great. Okay. So now we're going to move into pronouns and gender inclusive language. So this is kind of like how-tos on how you can talk to other people and be inclusive. So first off, why do we talk about inclusive language? It really has impact on various spaces, so not just like interpersonally, but also in laws, public space, healthcare. You think about how often like names and gender comes up in conversation. You know, even if you think about your own self, like saying like girl or man, or you know, gender stereotype expectations on other people, like assuming a woman has a husband and things like that. There's all these assumptions that we engage in every day, and you kind of have to like combat that to be more inclusive. So pronouns, everyone uses pronouns. It's a staple in the English language. I, you, he, she, they, all of those are pronouns. It's just a replacement for a name. You can't always tell by looking at someone what their pronouns are, but pronouns are a way of being visible, especially for like trans and non-binary folks, because if we are having a conversation and I introduce myself and I tell you my pronouns, it's a way for you to be like, oh, this is a person in the LGBTQ plus community, you know, but it's a way for us to relate to each other and respect each other if we're respecting each other's pronouns. Pronouns don't necessarily equal identity. So what I mean by that is whatever pronoun someone uses, it doesn't necessarily equal like this person is a lesbian or this person is trans or this person is whatever. You really have to like dig more into that if that is the topic of conversation. But it's important to remember those things aren't one-to-one. There are neo-pronouns, so what that means is new pronouns. So it's like they're outside of some of these more like standard pronouns in the English language. So like he, she, they, I, you. So there's some on the screen right now. Fay, fair is an example. It, the, here. You might hear those. What I would recommend is asking the person like, how do you conjugate that, and then practice on your own. That's the best way to do it, because it's like learning any other new word. You just kind of like have to practice and you'll get used to it. And there's also pronouns in languages beside English, so elle and elie. And somebody might have like additional pronouns outside of like the English language as well that they might share with you. Okay, so here's some like practical situations that might come up, and some like language that you can use to like make this a little bit more accessible. So I want to make sure I'm referring to you correctly. What pronouns do you use? Nice to meet you. My name is Rob. My pronouns are he, him. When you introduce yourself with your pronouns, it gives that other person like a green light kind of to share their pronouns with you. You're saying, I am a safe place. I respect pronoun usage, and like I'm here for you. Like I want to make sure that we're both being respectful to each other. Could you pronounce that pronoun for me so I can make sure I get it right? Same thing with like, how do you conjugate that? No one's going to mind. You know, it's just about being respectful to each other and making that effort to learn for each other. Okay, so you might make a mistake. That's totally okay. The important thing is that you are working on it, and then you are decentering your own feelings from that. So what I mean by that is, like, if you make a mistake, it is not the LGBTQ plus person's job to comfort you about it. You kind of have to like decenter yourself from the mistake and be like, I will work on this. Apologize concisely, correct the phrase, you know, say, oh, I'm so sorry. he, you know, like it can just be like a quick little interaction. It doesn't have to be like a long thing because it then makes it more about you than the person. Reflect on how you see that person and then definitely like practice. Try not to say it's hard. There is like a learning curve to some of this, but you know, again, like you can feel that internally, but it's not always nice to say that to the other person, right? So here's some other examples. I'm so sorry, I meant they are in charge of the meeting. Thank you for correcting me. I apologize. I should have said she is an amazing student. So just like these quick interactions, acknowledging the feelings, making a change, moving on, practicing, because that's like the work that we have to do, you know? There's no one way to look or be LGBTQ+. One component of embracing all people is to not make assumptions about people's genders or sexualities, and also not making assumptions about like what we do, who we are, things like that. So like most of this is just breaking down your assumptions and letting people tell you who they are, because then you can connect, right? So we're not making assumptions about who people's partners are, what their marital status is, what their pronouns are. We are letting people come to us, having a person-to-person conversation and meeting each other where we are, because that's what we would want for ourselves, right? All right, so now we're going to move into a practice scenario. The way these are going to work is we are going to ask for basically your thoughts on it. So it's going to be like this person said this thing, what are you going to do? So just raise your hand if you have feedback here for the chat or for the online folks. Feel free to enter your responses into the chat, or if you want to unmute, that's totally fine too. Just give us like a heads up, and then I'll repeat everybody's responses into the microphone, and then we'll talk about it together. Everybody got it? Cool. All right. All right, so this first scenario, person one, you know, this is just like, we're here, there's new people. Is this your first time? I haven't met you before. So glad to welcome you. Okay. Person two, thank you. It seems so nice here. Person one, let me introduce you to my wife, Lily. Lily, I want you to meet this person. She's new here. Person two, oh, actually I don't use she, her, I'm not a girl. How do you respond? What could person one have done differently? Yeah.
Introduce themselves with their own pronouns.
Okay, so the response was introduce themselves with their own pronouns. Absolutely right. If you introduce yourself with your pronouns, it gives that other person that opening to like give you that information, so you don't have that like misgendering moment. You know, because they're new, you don't know. But that's a good example of an assumption. We're making an assumption and inadvertently using the wrong pronoun, when if we had just done that general opening, maybe we could have avoided that. Anybody else? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, coming from, I guess, personal experience, like a good safe thing to do always is just like maybe go with like a gender neutral thing first, and then things get more depth, then
Yeah.
ask things like that.
Yeah, totally. Okay, so that response was like, instead of going with like gendered language, going with like a more like gender neutral sort of approach. So like, for this example, you could be like, they're a new person here, or like, this is a new person here. Like, both of those are gender neutral, you know, and you can kind of avoid that until you have a good opening to exchange pronouns, or until you like find out later, what have you. But just like tweaking the way that we're talking a little bit so that we're more inclusive. Any other thoughts? Anybody online? Okay, yeah, go ahead.
So you could say at the end, oh, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have assumed. Can you tell me what your pronouns are?
Yeah, exactly. So that response was, oh, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have assumed. What are your pronouns? So that's an excellent way to go about that. acknowledging the feelings, concise apology, and a correction. So like you need to gather the information in that situation because you don't have it, you know. But if you knew, you could just do that quick, like, oh, I'm sorry, like they or he or what have you. Great. Good job. Yeah.
Good. To simplify, you could just say person's name. You're going to introduce, hi, this is Sue, you know, who just joined us or something. So you don't even have to get into the pronoun thing.
Yeah.
I would worry about making an error.
Yeah, exactly. So like, the suggestion was to use the person's name instead. Absolutely. You know, because sometimes like conversation goes a little quicker and maybe like asking the pronouns doesn't come to mind at first. So then you could just use a person's name, completely fine. You know. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm going back into the business world, and there, I'm just thinking, if you meet someone and you don't assume they're male or female, they may get very insulted. So it's a very difficult line to tread.
Can you expound on that a little bit?
Well, it is just as I said, if I meet, for example, a customer, where you have to be very careful of the way you speak. If you meet a customer who, from dress or manner, portrays male or female, if you don't say he or she, they might get very insulted.
I have never experienced that. I said I have never experienced that. It definitely could be the case, but
And this is hypothetical, I'm not
yeah.
sure
So
how
I
to actually come across
yeah
the situation.
in general, like most of the way that people interact nowadays is much more like casual, you know. Even in like business settings, the best way to go about that is to just say like I want to make sure I'm using the right like pronouns for you. If somebody gets upset that you're trying to respect them, that's a them problem and not a you problem. You know, so just be like, I want to make sure that I'm being respectful to you. Like, what pronouns do you use? What like honorifics? So like Mr., Miss, like what have you. It's better to just ask, and then you can do what you need to do. You know, but in general, most people don't get upset unless they have their own like internal feelings to work on. You know, and again, that's not your problem.
Actually, I was gonna say, you could scratch my comment, because my comment comes from a generation ago, so there may be a complete change in the social structure.
Yeah, I think it's like much more casual. So like a lot of those honorifics kind of drop. So like Mr., Mrs., stuff like that. You know, but definitely there's going to be people that do want that. And then that's just like a conversation, you know, because we work with a lot of colleges as well. And sometimes that comes up because you have the generation differences with the alum. So yeah, just asking like what people prefer and then going with that.
Yeah, I wanted to add another thing
Yeah, go
too.
ahead.
Is like there's also ways to be very like cordial or like welcoming to people that don't have to be gendered too. Like sometimes I've worked with like even like a restaurant or something, and I've said like guests or like my guest. That's like a gender neutral way of like showing like I'm trying to be very like inviting to you, or you know, there's ways. I do agree that like people are generally pretty casual, but like Rain and I, we sell things a lot, and so we sell our art, and so when we're talking to like people who understand, we try to find ways of using that gender neutral language while still being welcoming. So I hear where you're coming from, but just getting a little bit creative with our language and thinking about ways that like we can still definitely be very, very we could still be formal while also, you know, not using sir or ma'am if we don't know, you know, somebody.
Yeah, because it's just like reducing assumptions, you know, because we can still be formal with people and like be respectful to folks with like dropping that down a little bit until we know for sure, you know, because once we know and if it doesn't like make them feel weird, because you know some people feel strange about a man, you know, So like figuring out what people are comfortable with. But yeah, like Robin said, we have a lot of customers and just like kind of. Yeah.
So we have a comment online, a customer could also get insulted if you gender them incorrectly.
Yes.
Still better not to make assumptions based on gender presentation or name.
Yeah, exactly. So the comment was,
A
well, I
customer-
guess people can see it online, so.
They can, but they.
Oh, right. So the comment was, if you misgender a person in that scenario, then that could hurt them, you know? So it's like it could be bad in either way when we assume stuff. So, and another thing to consider is like a lot of like trans folks, when we get misgendered constantly, we will not come back to things, you know? It's pressure to not go to places. And so like that's why this is so important, because we need community, because we're vulnerable folks. Yeah. Any other comments before we move on? If not, it's okay. Yeah, go ahead.
One pronoun that bothers me is using they as a singular.
Okay.
And I don't like that one because it leads to ambiguous speech, ambiguous language. Are they talking about one person or more than one person? I've seen it in writing, and I said, what are they talking about? So in that case, if it leads to ambiguity, then I think it's not good.
So, all right. So the comment is like that the singular pronoun they can lead to ambiguity, and there's some discomfort with that. So first thing I would suggest is like decentering yourself from that, because it's more so about the person than it is about like, you know, the individual that's like outside of that experience. A singular they has been used in the English language for a very long time. There's examples of it in Shakespeare's writing, and it's pretty normal too. Like say you don't know something about the other person, so like you get a new coworker or something and you don't know anything about them. Oh, I heard the new person is going to start on Tuesday, or they are going to start on Tuesday. You know, so that's a way that you would talk about that person without knowing, and it's a singular situation. Often you get the specificity from like the context. So like in that situation, it's a coworker. So you know that it's a singular they, but it's very like standard in English. We often don't realize that we're doing it because we don't think about it, because it's just like ingrained in the language. But I would definitely recommend like practicing it and like decentering yourself from it. And I know that can be hard, but it's always okay to like ask a clarifying question as long as it's in good faith, you know? And because you could just be like, just clarifying, we're just talking about one person, or are we talking about more than one person? You know, that's a respectful way to like clarify that, and it like decenters any like feelings from it. Any thoughts? Yeah, go ahead.
I wonder, is the community really comfortable with the term queer? It seems to me somewhat derogatory. Could there be another phrase or another noun?
So it depends on the generation. There's been like younger folks have pretty much like reclaimed it. So you see this in like other communities where it might be like a derogatory term that has been reclaimed by that community to like reduce harm. We find that like some older generations aren't as comfortable with that, and that's totally okay. But you know, if a younger person identifies with it and feels comfortable with it, totally okay. I think like a good rule is to like don't assume that they're okay with it unless they say they're okay with it, and that's probably the best way to go about it. So defaulting to like LGBTQ plus community, but there's definitely been a reclaiming, and it was used in a derogatory way like historically.
Yeah, just to speak briefly about like the history of the reclamation of the term, the first instances of the term being reclaimed are in like the early 1900s, and then there's a really strong movement during the 1980s during the AIDS crisis, and so a lot of that connection to the term is a pride in like community resilience and reclamation of like taking back a word that was used to harm us. And so a lot of people get a lot of joy and power from that. And Rain is totally right that there sometimes is a little bit of a generational difference. But I will say that like a lot of folks who we know who are older and queer, in their 70s and 80s do also still like the term queer, so it's not, you know, I think that there's a slight political charge to the word queer. There's like a power that comes from that reclamation, and so that might be where some of the discomfort comes from. And I would say for folks who aren't queer, who might feel uncomfortable with it, is to like kind of sit with that discomfort a little bit. It's meant to upset the status quo, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I'm gay, and we did sit-ins to get rid of that connotation. And yeah, I'm one of the ones that are offended by that term because the definition is very mean. I had friends who died to get rid of that word during the 60s and 70s. I am really kind of offended that we brought that back into our community.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, especially if you identify in the LGBTQ plus community, it's okay to like feel discomfort from it and not want to be identified that way. Completely fair. There's like the other side of it too, that some people identify that way, and you can't really like change it so much, but it's a matter of just being like, I respect your view of yourself, and I respect my view of myself, and I hope that you do too. Yeah, so I would assume that most people would be respectful of that view as well, because I mean that's how we look at it as well, you know. So the comment was just to repeat it for everybody, that there's like a lot of discomfort with like identifying as queer and using that word, and that there's a historical pushback against like that being used, and discomfort with the definition. But yeah, there's going to be like two sides of it just because of the generational difference, because like a lot of younger folks do identify that way. But it's completely fair to feel discomfort with it. Yeah, Jane.
Could you define the word queer? Because there is the word gay, lesbian, homosexual. So what's queer?
Yeah. Okay. So the question is, what is queer? Queer is just an umbrella term for the LGBTQ plus community. It's also like a little bit of a rebellion against like a specific label. So often it's used in a political format to like not be put into a particular box like lesbian, gay, bisexual. It's just saying like, I am not straight, maybe like I am not a cisgender person. And so it's like a reclamation of that term, and it's a umbrella term. So it's a little abstract, but yeah.
I also want to add that language is inherently fluid. So like what a word means at one point can change over time. And in some ways, language means what you feel it means personally for you, but that also means that language means something completely different depending on the person. And so while queer as a word might mean something very particular to someone that was a part of like the gay liberation movement, and was there during the AIDS crisis and everything, for me as a younger person that is in the LGBTQ plus community, I hear queer as a label that my friends use more often than any other, because it's so ambiguous that when people are like, I know I'm not straight, but all this other stuff is confusing and I'm not gonna get into it. They're like, I'm queer and that's over. Like, we're not talking about it more because I don't know and I don't wanna deal with this right now. And so I think that because language has that fluidity, it is like, the word queer has changed with time in a very big way.
Definitely. And I think too, like, especially a lot of the younger generations, like, people aren't gonna stop.
Our Zoom person's trying to figure out what that is. We don't know.
Okay. A lot of people, like, people aren't gonna stop calling us slurs, you know, which is unfortunate. So sometimes reclaiming those is a way to combat that. But the other side of that is valid. So like asking that it just not be said at all, you know. But I think that there can be mutual respect on both sides. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so as a member of the LGBTQ community from the middle of those, so from the 80s, 90s, it has an extremely positive connotation for my generation. So it's like a really like stand up for who you are, be heard, be allowed to be out there connotation. So I don't know that as an 80s child I knew that it might be offending earlier generations that we were trying to reclaim it, but that's the connotation it has for my age group. Not everyone,
Yeah.
but for many in my cohort.
Yeah, and I'm a similar age group, but I grew up rurally, and the word probably had a different connotation where I grew up than where somebody else did. So I think it's really interesting, not just talking about the fluidity of language under so many other types of fluidity that we're talking about, but also just how we each have a set of experiences with these issues that comes from the year in which we were born, the place where we grew up, the experiences that we have, our own identity of ourselves, and that the biggest thing is kind of learning about each other and respecting all of those things and what we bring to the table, and asking rather than assuming, and then trying to be respectful.
Yeah, absolutely. And because we can hold both of those things at the same time, right? So like that feeling of positivity and that feeling of harm, you know, like those both can exist at the same time, and we can both be respectful of those, because, you know, how people feel about themselves, we're not gonna change that ever, you know, and we shouldn't want to. So I think there's space for both of those. Any other thoughts? Okay. All right. There we go. All right, so now we're going to move into anti-LGBTQ plus bias, and I'm going to hand it back over to Robin. I stole your water, I'm sorry.
That's all good. Hello, awesome. So we're going to be talking a little bit about anti-LGBTQ plus bias. As somebody who identifies as queer, I just wanted to add my own one thought to bring us into the bias conversation. I think so. The original the word queer basically gains a lot of momentum during the trial of Oscar Wilde. That's kind of the actual genesis of the term queer, because basically they couldn't talk about, he was on trial for air quote homosexual acts, and they couldn't talk about his acts. And so they were using it in a derogatory way. It gained steam from there. But the original definition of the term queer means weird or other. And what I would encourage people to lean into is that being weird or other isn't a bad thing. I really don't resonate with a lot of the language that's queer people are just like everyone else, because I feel like everyone is really unique. It sounds a little similar to when people say things like, I don't see color or something like that, because my experience is unique and I'm happy with my difference. I don't need to feel like cisgender or heterosexual people in order to feel like my life is worth living. And also, just to elaborate, and I really appreciate you bringing up your perspective on the term queer. And I would just add to contribute to the complexities of this, that people have also died to use the term queer. And that is also, we are also part of that movement. So yeah. Understanding key biases about our community is incredibly important for identifying where these biases might exist within yourself. So I'm going to go through them. A lot of times we're viewed as overtly sexual, and you'll see this coming out especially when people talk about LGBTQ pluses relationships with children. A great example of that is the anger over LGBTQ plus drag story hours. People will say things like, this is indoctrinating our children, or all of these wild things, when in reality they're very similar to a Disney princess giving a story hour. They're not overtly sexual at all. In fact, their general message is you should love yourself. But because queer people are viewed as inherently sexual, we are seen as not appropriate for children or something like that. Statistically, we all engage about similar levels of sexuality, and so that is a specific bias directed towards our community. We're also viewed as unnatural, even when most animals in the animal kingdom display some kinds of same-gender attraction. Something that's really interesting, actually, is that a lot of zoologists are having to go through and redo research of previous generations, because zoologists used to be trained when they see animals having sex in the wild, they were trained to assume that one was male and one was female. What they have begun to realize is that it's more 50-50 because animals engage in sexuality for more reasons than just reproduction, for benefits to their, social standing in the squirrel community. There's all kinds of reasons why animals engage in sexuality. And so it's incredibly natural to have same-gender relationships. Likewise, there are animals that basically display different kinds of gender. I mean, animal gender is not like people gender, but they do try to communicate their roles in a society in different ways. There's also the bias or assumption that we all think the same. You'll hear things like the gay agenda, transgender ideology. I mean, even our discussion of queer in this room illustrates that we have a really wide range of perspectives. Not all LGBTQ plus people think the same, but a lot of times people who are against us will try to paint us as an ideology rather than a kind of person. And that is so that they can try to discredit our lives and our existences. The truth is that we don't agree on a lot of things. I mean, there is divisions within the community between trans and non-binary people, between gay folks and trans gay folks. There is all these inter-community debates. And then from the outside, there's this assumption that we have, a gay committee or something, and I would just assure you that I never got a membership card, there's no governance, and that's true of any category of person. There's not caucuses to decide what we believe about things. And so if you're reading an article and they say something like the gay agenda or trans ideology, know that they're probably engaging in some forms of bias, because like I said, there's no cohesive gay agenda. I mean, even basic things we disagree on. And so understanding that is really important to understanding our complexities. We're also often viewed as unprofessional. The LGBTQ plus community experiences higher rates of unemployment. And oftentimes people assume that we're disruptive to a workplace or something like that. Something specific that I experienced was someone, I explained at the time I used they, them pronouns, and they were like, I've never dealt with somebody like you. I need you to not tell our clients that. And I was like, all right, I need this job, and so I'm gonna push through. But that was not a great way to respond to that. I've also had parents, I used to teach preschool, I've had parents complain that I was near their children in any way. Very interesting, because I have all my child clearances, I have a master's degree, I love kids, they're fabulous. So it's all of those biases impacted my ability to have that job, because I mean, they didn't fire me, but it was incredibly uncomfortable to know that people are hyper watching me because they think that inherently because I'm queer that I'm trying to do something weird to children. Thank you, I appreciate it. So we all have biases. When you understand those biases, it's good to reflect on them. You do not have a choice as to whether or not you have biases. You've grown up in a society that is full of biases about all kinds of people, but you do have a choice about how you act on relearning and engaging with understanding those biases. Even other LGBTQ people can be biased towards each other. So ask yourselves, how can this reflection deepen our understandings and our connections to ourselves and others? Knowing that we are biased is going to help us engage in unlearning that. I really like this quote by Audre Lorde, which is, "My silences had not protected me, your silences will not protect you." And I say that to encourage us to step into spaces of standing up for LGBTQ plus people. Now this part is gonna get a little bit a difficult conversation, but I'm gonna move quickly through it because, again, we don't have that much time. But it's important to also trace the roots of where these biases come from. So the first thing I have on our list here is colonialism. A lot of these anti-LGBTQ plus biases can be traced to our history of colonization of the United States and other areas of the world. Specifically when folks from Europe came to colonize what is now called the United States, they were seeing people expressing genders and sexualities in ways that they viewed different as their own, and in that process of colonization forcibly stripped people from cultural practices and forced those gender norms on our communities. A good example of that is residential schools, so Indigenous children being taken from their families, and one of the practices that they made, especially assigned male at birth children do, is to cut their hair. In Indigenous cultures, a lot of them, and not all of them, but majority in the United States, hair is like really sacred. But they were saying oh, this is not like normal for your gender, so they're forcing people to cut their hair. This is directly linked to gender and sexuality and forcing that binary on folks. Then we move down to, and that's also connected in some ways to white supremacy being a system that understands that the only good people are white, able-bodied, non-queer people. And we can trace that history even farther back to eugenics, which is a false racist science that's essentially trying to only promote that very small kind of person. And if you see things like, a lot of early eugenicists were writing about something called degeneration theory, which is the idea that a race, air quote, degenerates into anybody who's not white, able-bodied, cisgender, not queer, essentially. And so they would call people who are different degenerates and stuff like that. And I think that it's clear you can see a connection to where we get some of the ideas that LGBTQ plus people are like deviant or hypersexual or stuff like that. There's also connections in there to ableism and sexism. And I bring up sexism specifically because a lot of times more feminine people experience higher discrimination or specifically violence. I mean, if you think of the way society treats like effeminate gay men or trans women, you can see a really clear example of how that intersection of being queer and being femme is causing, or people face higher rates of violence. That's not to say that people who are masked don't face violence, because they most certainly do. But there's a clear connection there to hating women, essentially. So why do we trace the roots? Understanding the systems that we invoke when we're engaging in bias, it's important to see how deep these roots run. If we trace the roots, we can also trace how we heal from them. And we can understand our investment in LGBTQ plus justice and liberation. So we're gonna come to our final part of welcoming the LGBTQIA2 plus community with Rain. And yeah.
So like Robin said, we're gonna move into like the welcoming part, and these are like practical things that you can do. So think of this as like your toolkit. First thing, listen to us. Whatever somebody tells you about their experience, there's no need to challenge it, because other people's ideas about themselves, how they feel about themselves, it's outside of us. It doesn't mean anything about you. It's just like respecting that other person. So pause before you speak when you hear new information, so make sure you're like digesting it, basically. Decenter yourself if you're told something. You said made someone uncomfortable, so like sometimes when we hear a correction, we get like defensive about it. But it's not about that, right? Like we want to make sure that we're being welcoming to other people and that we're honoring their experience of themselves. So like if someone is making that correction to you, just be like, oh, I'm so sorry, and then make the change, right? It's a simple thing to do, but just like pause, and if you feel something about that, that's something to like reflect on and work through later without that person. Like I said, being defensive is a natural response, but to put that labor onto the marginalized person is a harm. So like it's not the marginalized person's job to educate you about everything, I guess, unless you're compensating them in some sort of way. But just do that internal work on your own. So if you feel defensive, like think about that. Maybe talk to your therapist if you have one, or talk to a friend. Like just like work on it. Center our perspective. So if especially like if you're not in the community, if someone tells you like their thoughts on the LGBTQ plus community, hold that. It's like if you're not in the community, then just respect that and center our perspective. Okay, so what does center mean? It means shifting. So there's procedures, structures, practices. So you're moving your idea of like the focus. So like when we get defensive about something, that makes us the center of attention versus like the other person's hurt feelings, which should matter in that scenario. So making it like kind of like give yourself like a formula that you can work with. So like when I feel defensive, I do this, you know. So like taking a beat and then just like honoring that person's feelings, because you don't have to agree with somebody necessarily to like be validating to their feelings. You can just be like, I understand this made you feel this way. I'm gonna make this correction because I care about you as a person, right? Centering is also prioritizing, so making sure you're doing that work for that other person, for that community. And it's moving beyond checking a box for like diversity, education, and inclusion. Because this sort of like education and work is like something that you need to carry on with you day to day and like with the people that you interact with. It's not just a checkbox and then you're done. It's work. The next thing that you can do is empower us, so give us opportunities to lead, so inviting us to come talk to you guys. You know, if there's any other opportunities, like even amongst your congregation, to come talk and tell you about their experiences. But even if there's like a committee or something like that, we need to be a part of the conversation and things, especially like if it affects us. Encourage us to get more involved. Even if it's not in a leadership role, and then research local resources so that you can connect us with services we might need. A caveat to that is like not everything is going to be LGBTQ plus inclusive. So like when I say research, make sure that resource is actually inclusive before like referring a trans person or something, you know. Protect us. In policy and in practice. So in policy, make sure that like a non-discrimination policy is great, and make sure to back it up. So if something happens, like do the thing that you're supposed to do. Like make sure that policy has teeth, so to speak. In practice, so if you see injustice, like do something about it. We can be gentle in that too. So if you see someone else misgendering somebody, you can just kindly go up to them and be like, hey, I'm just reminding you that their pronouns are they, them, or their pronouns are he, him, you know, what have you. Like that is protecting us, but it can go beyond that as well. So like, if you see a trans person getting hassled out in the world, like you can protect people as well, even just by being present sometimes. But whatever your comfort level is, that's totally understandable as well. Stand up for us when we're not in the room. So if you are having a conversation with other people that are not in the LGBTQ plus community and they're like talking about someone that is, and it's not nice, like stand up for that person and make that correction. Because you don't have to be like aggressive to do that either. You can be gentle. There's no both sides to equality. So LGBTQIA2 plus people are not a debate topic. We exist. We deserve basic human rights. There's no like other side to that because we're a type of person, you know. So you can't really like argue against that. People do that, but it's more of a bigotry kind of thing, right? And then celebrate LGBTQIA2 plus people. Understand everyone has a place in our liberation. Finding yours will help you avoid a savior complex and move more towards becoming an accomplice. So what I mean by accomplice is that you're doing that work. So making sure to use inclusive language, honoring that person's identity, doing your part to like protect us. So that's what being an accomplice means. Like it's actually doing the work in the world, and that's what makes everything safer for everybody. And you do it as a community. You don't have to do it alone. Like you have all these people in here that care about this topic. So like you have each other. All right, so we're gonna do another practice. So same format, just raise your hand and then let me know how you respond, and then I'll repeat it and we can talk. Okay, so person one. I guess it's okay for adults to identify however they want, but I just don't like that they're forcing it on kids. How could you respond?
Angrily.
Yeah, fair.
We force all kinds of things on kids.
Yeah.
What's the big deal?
Yeah, for sure. Like, aggression is fair. You know, cause like this question, or this like statement in and of itself, is based on a fallacy, right? It's like assuming that something is being done to kids, in like a permanent or negative way, and like there's not like parents and doctors involved, and it's like this dark cabal, and it's like that's not a thing. So like, yeah, fair. Aggression is totally a like response.
Not very productive, but.
Yeah, but it is an option, totally. Yeah, go ahead.
I'd say, what do you mean by that? I don't understand what you're talking about.
Yeah, totally. So the response was like, I don't know what you mean by that. Like, tell me more. Like, what do you mean? Great, confusion. So aggression, confusion. Those are great responses. Because when we respond with confusion, it makes the person say the quiet part out loud. So what I mean by that is like they will eventually have to say whatever like misconception or something like darker, honestly, like some transphobia, homophobia, like what have you. They'll have to say that out loud, and they probably won't. So it's pressure to get them to like think about it more. Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Just wearing Catholic shirt.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Fair. So the response is like bring up the Catholic Church. Humor. Yeah, totally. Yeah, do you have one?
Well, I was gonna say, any religion is indoctrinating kids.
Yeah.
And also they're being indoctrinated because they get the princess, the fairy princess, the happy marriage,
Mhm.
go off to the happily ever after. That's all indoctrination. I mean, I grew up, that we would get married and have children. I mean,
Yeah. So like, the comment was like pointing out the ways that kids are indoctrinated like every day. Like that's completely fair. So like, if you point out like more mundane things that are already happening, it's like, oh, this is not actually like a real thing that I should get upset about. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I think that we've like hit our.
Oh, okay. Okay.
So, but this was the end anyway. It's our last.
Okay.
And so if people want to continue the conversation, me and Maria will be here.
Yeah.
And I'm gonna pass it back off to the folks in charge.
Thank you so much, everybody.
I would like to leave you all with this quote from Marcia Pay It No Mind Johnson, a member of the gay liberation movement and prominent figure of the Stonewall Uprising, who likely would have identified as transgender if she were alive today. History isn't something you look back at and say it was inevitable. It happens because people make decisions that are sometimes very impulsive and of the moment, but those moments are cumulative realities. You are now invited to look into the face of those nearest to you, whether in person or on screen. The face near yours belongs to a person whose heart is sometimes tender, whose skin is sometimes thin, whose eyes sometimes fill with tears, whose laughter is a beautiful sound. The face near yours belongs to a person who is seeking wholeness and knows that you are doing the same. May you leave this time together changed. May the promises you have made to yourself about who you want to feel closer to the reality of who you are right now. May you share that feeling of transformation wherever you go. May it spread into every word, deed, thought, and interaction until we are all changed, transformed, and transforming together, becoming our better selves. May your hearts remain open, may your voices stay strong, and may your hands remain outstretched.